Ladies and gents, welcome back. We are here today to talk about one man, Mr. Lucas Paqueta. And I was thinking about how we were going to talk about this. This guy has had the year from hell. In this video today, we're going to cast our minds back to, firstly, what made him such a valuable player for West Ham. We obviously signed him for upwards of £40 million from Lyon. My only kind of experience or knowledge of him was when we played against him in the Europa League that previous season, and he looked a really, really exciting player. He was fun to watch, but ultimately we took them apart and then took their best player, which was kind of nice. But you fast forward to where we are today, the excitement of that guy that signed has completely disappeared, and we're now left with a guy who is a shadow of that player, who has become a bit of a scapegoat for a lot of things as well. Whether you think that's fair or not is entirely up to you. But I wanted to look at it and see what kind of journey he's been on with West Ham, and how do we now get the best out of him? Can we get the best out of him? Has his ship sailed? A lot of people want to write him off now. Again, that's up to you. But I thought, let's have a look at the journey. Let's have a look at what we're doing with him now, and let's see whether we can actually get the best out of him moving forward. As ever, please do like the video. Please do subscribe if you're not already. And please do let me know what you think in the comments. I thought I wanted to pick a couple of games first and foremost from his first season that highlighted the kind of player that he had built himself into at West Ham. And this was the first game I remember really sort of taking notice of him as a player. He started this game away at Newcastle early on in the season in a midfield two with Declan Rice in front of a back three. A ground that was really hard to go to in that season. We ultimately managed to pick up a 1-1 draw. Paqueta scored and was really, really good in that game. I remember being just blown away by having a guy in centre midfield who was so comfortable picking the ball up from either his keeper, the defenders, and just inviting players to come and press him and literally saying to them, just come and try and get the ball off me. He would drag someone out of position and he would bring someone else into play. And he was just so calm and collected. And we put in a brilliant away performance that day. Ultimately, it was a bit back and forth for quite a while. Newcastle were the ones pushing towards the end of the game. But you came away from St James's Park with a 1-1 draw where not a lot of teams went and got a result. And ultimately, he kind of announced himself. I know he took a few games to kind of get going under David Moyes. I think it was always difficult signing flair players and then playing them under David Moyes, because Paqueta is the kind of guy that needs to be able to roam free and kind of go and do what he wants to do. Moyes didn't really let him, and then was kind of forced to let him, and couldn't really figure out where to play him. Obviously, this is a lineup without Thomas Souček, who ultimately forces his way back into the team. And we see Paqueta go from playing deeper with Declan Rice to then being the more advanced player, Souček being the player that sat further back, and Declan Rice sort of playing the 8 and getting further forward as well. And ultimately, that is a large part of why West Ham struggled in the league that season. The midfield three, it was really hard to find a way of getting them all in their best positions. At this time, I think when we signed Paqueta, he was playing deep for Lyon, he was playing deeper for Brazil, and he started off playing deeper for West Ham, but then he got pushed forward into the 10, and it didn't quite suit him for a while, but we saw glimpses of genius. And the other game that I wanted to kind of highlight those glimpses of genius is a game that needs really no introduction, which is the Conference League final. And the reason I wanted to highlight this one is this is obviously the final game of Paqueta's first season. And this was a game where we see that midfield three of Rice, Souček, and Paqueta. And this is a game where Paqueta did not see the ball at all, really. I think he made like 20 passes in the game, which for your number 10 isn't really what you'd expect. But without wanting to go into the semantics of this actual game, the only time he really, really needed to make that pass was in the 90th minute at 1-1. You need a guy who's going to come up clutch and thread through the perfect through ball. And he did just that. And the rest is history. I don't need to tell you what happens from there. So I think for me to kind of outline the value that Paqueta had built in himself, we had seen the kind of ability to pick the ball up from deep, the almost arrogance that he plays with, or played with, should I say. And I love that. Like, for me personally, as a West Ham fan, I'm not all about, like, I just want to be entertained. I don't care about the result. Ultimately, you want to win football games. But there's nothing like seeing your, like, deep line midfielder pick the ball up 18 yards out from his own goal and try and beat somebody. Like, for me, it's heart in mouth, and he gets a lot of abuse from a lot of areas of the fans for doing it. But when it comes off, it does look fun. And after this, obviously, we win this game, we win the trophy, and ultimately, he is on the verge of sealing a move to Manchester City. And this is a good point to kind of say, first and foremost, the comparisons here were being made between him and Dimitri Payet, which, again, you cast your mind back. I can see why the comparisons were made. I don't necessarily agree with them, but he showed glimpses of genius. He was a bit of a rogue. He didn't really fit into a system. But the difference between the two for me is Payet was consistent for a whole season. He won games on his own. He carried that team. Paqueta never did. He never has. He's shown glimpses of that quality, but in really, really short spells. Maybe like there'll be like a 45 minutes within a game where you go, wow, this guy is unbelievable. He was being called world class, and like justifiably for a short time. But the difference is Payet did it for a year. He got nominated for the Ballon d'Or. He carried that West Ham team. Paqueta's never done that. But, you know, those comparisons were being made, and ultimately the guy was on the verge of an £85 million transfer to Premier League champions Manchester City. And fast forward or rewind, wherever your brain is right now, to an away game against Bournemouth where the deal is on the verge of being done, but we need him to play. He begrudgingly plays. He gets a yellow card for a handball late on in the game, and maybe days later, maybe a week later, he's accused of spot fixing in that game and 3 others from the previous season. And ultimately, that £85 million transfer falls through. And you look at where we are now and what could have been. Certainly from you bought a player 1 year, a year later, he's worth double. That's cash in the bank. There was obviously, we were allegedly quite close to signing Cole Palmer. And I don't need to tell you what he's gone on to do. So you look at what could have been. Wow, if this hadn't happened, we wouldn't be sat here talking about this guy. This guy would be playing for Manchester City and maybe tearing it up, maybe not. You look at what Matthias Nunez has done since he's gone there. He's done absolutely nothing. Maybe Paqueta would have been the same. Who knows? But we are where we are. And over the course of the next year and 2 months, or 6 weeks, whatever you want to call it, his form has just disappeared. And look, it doesn't take a genius to understand why that's happened. The guy had all of his dreams about to be realised. When he moved originally from Brazil, I think he went to AC Milan. It didn't work for him. He went to Lyon. It worked, but it didn't work for him. I don't think he was loved by the fans as much as he kind of was in that first season for West Ham before these accusations were made. He never really settled, and we were warned about that. But ultimately, he's helped us win our first trophy in 43 years. And we all would have waved him farewell for double the money that we had signed him for. Ultimately, it fell through. And we've just struggled to really find a way of getting the best out of him. But I wanted to highlight a game in which we did get the best out of him. Not necessarily because he was the main man, but there's a time where we were playing him on the left-hand side. And in this game, we won this game 4-2, and we were absolutely fantastic in this game. We were brilliant. And you look at some of the key performers in this game, Emerson and Jared Bowen, who Paqueta, just by playing on the left wing, manages to get them both involved in the game more. I think it's no surprise that I'll mention the fact that Emerson's at his best when Lucas Paqueta plays on the left. They're obviously good mates off the pitch. They understand the way each other plays. They played together the year previously at Lyon. Emerson was on loan there and ultimately ended up signing for West Ham. And they were both really good in this game. Emerson obviously scored the absolute thunderbolt from 25, 30 yards. I can't remember. And Bowen scored a hat-trick. Mohamed Kudus played on the right-hand side in a spell where he was really, really good on that right-hand side. Again, you're getting Mo into his best position here. You're getting the best out of Emerson. Jarrod Bowen scored a hat-trick. So you look at the kind of way that David Moyes changed his position. You've got Alvarez and Souček. Alvarez, Souček, Ward-Prowse in the middle here. And yes, that is not a dynamic midfield, but he just knew how to kind of play around the fact that we didn't have a very dynamic midfield. And Paqueta was still... It felt like, as much as he had played with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he was able to find some freedom on the left-hand side with a player that he's comfortable playing with. You then look on the other side, you were getting the best out of Mo in a period where he was fantastic. Jarrod Bowen went up front and was scoring goals for fun at that time. And you go, well, you look at that and you're making the best out of a bad situation. Ultimately, that's not necessarily the way that Lopetegui plays. And this rings pretty true for me. As we had signed Lopetegui, I was actually on Sky Sports News talking about how excited I was for Lopetegui to join. And within 2 hours of my 5 minutes on TV, charges were formally brought against Lucas Paqueta. And again, like you then look at, there was talk about, does Paqueta move on? Like, are the charges going to be, are the accusations going to be cleared? Do we then cash in on him? Do we then reinvest? Or do we keep him and get the best out of him? But ultimately, that all kind of paled into insignificance. Charges have been brought. This is dragged on for over a year, and it's going to push on to about 2 years by the time it reaches its climax. And Lopetegui's now inherited a problem. He's inherited a problem in that he's got a guy that has these genius qualities, but we just can't seem to find them. If we look at what was his... There we go. If we look at what was probably his best game of the season, maybe. He scored a goal. The 8 out of 10 rating from SofaScore is probably a bit generous, if I'm honest. He was pretty poor in the first half, but the second half where he played with a bit of freedom, he was a lot better. Got his goal, was delighted for him, and this is the first time that we've really seen West Ham at anywhere approaching their best, albeit against a pretty poor Ipswich side. But I look at where we're at with Lucas Paqueta now, and can we get the best out of him? Will we ever get the best out of him? I don't know whether we ever will, but I do think that getting the best out of him is going to be crucially important to West Ham's season. I don't think that we can carry on playing certainly this midfield three, but any midfield three that includes Lucas Paqueta if he's going to be a passenger. You've gone from a guy that, you look back at that Conference League final that I brought up a moment ago, a guy that was the difference maker. Granted, Bowen was the difference maker, let's be honest, but Bowen doesn't score that goal if Paqueta doesn't play the ball through. And instead of having the guy that you can turn to in a moment and go, can you find some inspiration? Can you find a crazy pass? Again, I look back at Luton away when we won 2-1, and Paqueta finds this piercing 30-yard Dyak to find Bowen at the far post, and Bowen scores. Again, that player just is nowhere to be seen. These first 7-8 games, however many it's been, he's been nowhere near that guy. And this game epitomised it for me, in that when we were building out from the back, he didn't want anything to do with it. It has us lining up here as this 4-1-4-1, which we kind of did, but more often than not, Lucas Paqueta was actually on the right-hand side of this. And if we were building up on the left-hand side, you were relying on Rodriguez and Souček to pick the ball up off of the defenders, which is not necessarily what they're most comfortable doing. They did a really good job of it. I thought both of them were solid. It was one of Souček's best games that we've seen in a while. He's just been getting progressively better. But when we look at what Paqueta had done previously, again, cast your mind back to that Brentford game I was talking about. Sorry, not Brentford game. The Newcastle game I was talking about, where he played in a midfield two. He had tons of responsibility on his shoulders. He took it in his stride. He was happy taking the ball off of the defenders or off of the goalkeeper. And throughout the course of that season, he didn't care. He played like a man who didn't care. He played like a guy who wanted the limelight on him. Again, in the way that he takes penalties as well. He wants the limelight on him. He takes these stutter, no-look penalties that the first couple of times I saw it drove me mental, but he hasn't missed one yet. Touch wood, guarantee he's going to miss one this weekend. But ultimately, you look at the way he played in this game, he didn't want to be involved in the build-up. He kept it very, very simple when he was on the ball until he was in the final third. And that first half was a disaster because he barely touched the ball in the build-up. But when he was in the final third, he just kept trying to play these little dink-through balls that were going nowhere. And he just kept giving the ball away. The second half, there was fewer of them. The game was pretty much over at 3-1. And he gets his goal. And he ultimately had a fairly decent second half. But just compare and contrast that with the player that we were used to seeing in his first season and the player that we were expecting or hoping to see in his second and now third season at West Ham. He's just absolutely miles off it. And to play in such a crucial position, we can't afford to be having passengers, ultimately. I'm a huge fan of the player and I absolutely love him to bits. Like some of the, as I mentioned, I want to see players who are entertaining. I cast my mind back to like Paolo Di Canio, and I was thinking about this. Was it a 5-4 against Bradford, in which Di Canio he gave it all. He showed his genius. He had a strop and he demanded to be substituted because he wasn't getting his way. We win a penalty, he rips it off of Frank Lampard. It was crazy. He was crazy, but we all loved him because we knew we could rely on him. We knew that he loved the club. We knew that he could dig us out of a hole when we needed someone to dig us out of a hole. But he was this lovable maverick that we thoroughly enjoyed watching at the time. Lucas Paqueta, for me, in his first season, looked like he was going to be that guy. And then these charges, these allegations, whatever you want to call them, reared their ugly head and have just killed any excitement. It's almost like it's killed his love of the game. He plays like a man who knows every game could be his last. But not in a good way. He plays in a way that he's feeling the pressure, whereas the guy that we signed played like he felt no pressure at all. We're obviously in an international break right now, and I'm sure there's a lot of you out there who have seen the criticisms from Brazil fans now, who, again, he was playing for Brazil regularly and playing with freedom. Again, cast your mind back to not long ago when Brazil played England at Wembley, and he had a really good game. Well, now Brazil fans are starting to turn on him as well. And he obviously takes great pride in playing for Brazil. I think it seemed to affect him quite a lot when Brazil stopped calling him up to try and just take him out the firing line a little bit. And we're probably at a phase where West Ham need to do that as well. And in my opinion, there's always room for Paqueta to make some kind of impact in a game. But we're going into a spell where we play Tottenham away, we play Manchester United at home. And we can't afford to be having a guy in there who his head's not in it. You want players in there who are up for what those games are, which is massive, massive games. They're super important to West Ham's season. And if Paqueta puts in the kind of performance that's been typical of him this season in those two games, well, we could get blown away by Spurs and we could end up not getting a result against Manchester United as well, which that then becomes a problem. So for me, you can look at the solution as we could push him to the left-hand side. But again, we're blocking a route into the first team for Crescencio Somerville, who is at the opposite end of things. He's an exciting player who's starting his career at West Ham. This could be his breakout moment, starting a game against Tottenham. You look at Mohamed Kudus. He's just put in a really good performance on the left against Ipswich. You'd be hard-pressed to not play him again there against Spurs. Yes, it's not his natural position, but he seems to be getting it. He seems to be clicking on that left-hand side. Or certainly he has in the last game. Maybe that continues. Who knows? It would be a big call to push Paqueta to the left-hand side. Maybe push Kudus to the right and play Bowen up front. Play a defensive midfield three of like Souček, Alvarez, Rodriguez. It doesn't inspire me, to be honest. It doesn't inspire me at all. For me, I think you probably do need to drag him out the firing line. I don't imagine that Lopetegui will make any changes this weekend, by the way. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in the week. But for me, he'll probably start this weekend. And if he has a bad game, which, like, let's be honest, I don't want to, like, I'm not into writing the guy off just because he's going through a lot and because he's playing poorly. But for me, if he has a bad game, you've got to drag him out the firing line. And I can't see a way of him just magically finding his top form without doing something, without helping him in some way. And I think taking him out the firing line for a little while is probably doing him a mercy. And it's probably going to say, right, you need to go away and find what makes you special. I remember David Moyes doing that with Felipe Anderson. Granted, it didn't necessarily work. But in terms of man management, it was the right thing to do. Felipe Anderson was a shell of himself. And Lucas Paqueta, funny enough, has similar kind of numbers at this stage of his West Ham career because of his dramatic drop-off, because he's just offered so little in terms of creativity, which is why he's in the team. Same happened to Felipe Anderson. And obviously, as we know, we signed him for a similar price, ended up letting him go on a free. And he ended up going to Lazio and doing pretty well. Typical West Ham. I don't want to see Paqueta go that way. I really, really don't. For me, I want us to figure out a way to get him back to his best. Whatever happens at the end of the season with these charges, it happens. It's out of all of our control. So I want to see us find a way to get the best out of him for what time we are guaranteed to have him as a West Ham player. And as I say, I think it's going to be crucially important for West Ham's season. The midfield has lacked creativity. It's lacked inspiration. And there's only one man who plays central midfield who has creativity, who has moments of inspiration that we could probably turn to and hopefully get him to win games that are in the balance. Because otherwise, we're going to go through these tough games against teams that we're going to be rivaling. I mean, I'd like to think for 7th or 8th, but realistically for the top half. If you don't have inspiration, then those games that you should be winning turn into draws. Those games that you should be drawing turn into losses. So ultimately, that's what we need to find. Let me know what you think in the comments. I believe we can still get the best out of him. Something needs to dramatically change. I'm not here to write him off, but let me know what you think. Appreciate your time watching, and we'll see you in the next one.